अस्सलामुअलैकुम दोस्तों, वेलकम बैक टू माय चैनल। दोस्तों आज की इस वीडियो में मैं आप लोगों को सीपीयू के बारे में बताऊंगा कि सीपीयू क्या है, क्या इसका सीन है। कि आप लोगों ने सुना होगा कि कंप्यूटर का जो प्रोसेसर है वो हाई होना चाहिए, सीपीयू उसमें अच्छा होना चाहिए। तो हम बेसिकली बात कर लें तो सीपीयू को ही प्रोसेसर कहा जाता है। बेसिकली सीपीयू और जो प्रोसेसर है वो एक ही चीज़ है, बस ना इनको कोई कहता है सीपीयू, कोई कहता है प्रोसेसर। तो फ्रेंड्स अपनी वीडियो का आगाज़ करते हैं। वीडियो शुरू करने से पहले आपसे गुजारिश है कि आपने अभी तक हमारे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब नहीं किया तो प्लीज़ हमारे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और वीडियो को लाइक कर दीजिए, क्योंकि हम डेली बेस पर आपके लिए ऐसे ही अमेजिंग वीडियोस लेकर आ रहे हैं। तो फ्रेंड्स अपनी वीडियो का आगाज़ करते हैं। CPU, alternatively referred to as a processor, central processor or microprocessor. The CPU, pronounced CPU is the central processing unit of the computer or computer. CPU handles all instructions it receives from hardware and software running on the computer. For example, the CPU process the instruction to use a web browser to open and display this web page on your computer. Overview. The picture below is an example of what the bottom and top of an AMD RYZEN processor may look. The processor is placed and secured into a compatible CPU socket found on the motherboard. Processor produce heat, so they are covered with a heat sink to keep them cool and running smoothly. To help transfer the heat between the CPU and heat sink, as seen in the picture above, the CPU chip is usually square with one notched corner to help make sure it's properly inserted into the CPU socket. On the bottom of the chip are hundreds of connector pins that correspond to the socket holes. Today most CPUs resemble the picture shown above. However, Intel and AMD have also experimented with slot processors. They were much longer and slid into a slot on the motherboard. Also, over the years, there were several types of sockets on motherboards. Each socket only supports specific types of processors and each has its own pin layout. What does the CPU do? The CPU main function is to take input from a peripheral, keyboard, mouse, printer, etc. or computer program and interpret what it needs. The CPU then either outputs information to your monitor or perform the peripheral requested task. CPU history. The CPU was first invented and developed at Intel with the help of Ted Hoff and others in the early 1970s. The first processor released by Intel was the 4004 processor shown in the picture. Components of the CPU. In the CPU, there are two primary components. ALU, arithmetic logic unit, performs mathematical, logical, and decision operation. 2. CU, control unit, directs all the processor operations. Over the history of computer processors, the speed and capabilities of the processor have dramatically improved. For example, the first microprocessor was the Intel 400, that was released on November 15, 1971 and had 2300 transmitters and performed 6000 operations per second. The Intel Pentium processor has transmitters and perform the instruction per second. फ्रेंड्स उम्मीद है कि आज की ये वीडियो आपको पसंद आई होगी। अगर पसंद आई है तो हमारे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और वीडियो को लाइक कर दीजिए। मिलते हैं नेक्स्ट वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए अल्लाह।